Brought to you by Pro Guides. Get video lessons on different games, now free for anyone. If I may be transparent, this script was a very difficult one to draft. Even now that it's complete, it's ended up being longer than I expected, and I barely touch upon some of the core ideas that made me write this script to begin with. Despite how often I praise Hearthstone's more complex aspects, I always end up surprised with how difficult it can be to conceptualize.
Annulus, you're just talking about the curve. There's nothing complicated about that.
Get out.
But I...
Get out.
Greetings and welcome to Hearthstone Theory. Now, straight to the point. Most players are capable of recognizing a good deck versus a bad deck, and what elements contribute to making one versus another. Adequate synergies, powerful cards, all of these aspects play a part. But every deck has a backbone, the core structure of how the deck works and its overall game plan. And the simplest model that players and streamers alike use to describe this structure is the curve, making that concept critical to consider. But show an inexperienced player a curve and they'll walk away with more questions than answers. Why does this curve peak at 3 drops? Is there any reason we can't see 8 mana cards separate from the 7 cost ones? How does this curve work if it only has 1 2-drop? Why does this curve look perfect but its deck is garbage? Is all of this curve talk just an oversimplification masking a complicated mixture of interactions and meta-defining elements? Today, we'll seek to answer some of those questions. Why does the curve exist in this way, and how does it affect the game? We'll touch upon the core structure of cards and how different types of decks, from aggro to mid-range to control, all use these different cards in conjunction. In the end, the question of why and how curves exist the way they do will hopefully be fully realized. As is normal for this channel, and for that matter every YouTube channel, press one of these buttons below if you're feeling expressive. This one if you wish me well, this one if you want to watch me more, and then comments for everything else. The last button is reserved for internet trolls and people who talk in the theater, so I don't recommend pressing that one. Anyways, let's begin. At the start of a game of Hearthstone, each player gets 2 resources. Mana, 1 for player 1 and 2 for player 2, and cards, 3 for player 1 and 4 for player 2. As each turn progresses, both players get more cards and more mana. The curve is representative of how the player spends those resources. With 30 cards in the deck, each bar represents how many cards have the listed mana cost. Most experienced players can look at a curve and identify it. For example, this is clearly a curve for an aggro deck. But what makes this a curve for an aggro deck? What aspects does it have compared to a mid-range curve or a control curve? And how do different aggressive decks with different curves compare and contrast? These questions are the ones that I seek to answer more definitively. Some of you may recall balance theory, a concept I defined that describes a pivotal aspect of Hearthstone. The idea is a bit oversimplistic, but the gist is that a mana crystal, a card, and 1/1 in stats are all worth the same amount. Yes, the concept has some holes in it, but for now let's take it as fact. If a player wants to get as many resources on the field in the first few turns as possible, then 1 mana cards are the key. Someone who plays 2 Dire Moles has used 2 cards and gotten a total of 8 stats. Compare that to a Firefly and a Flame Elemental, which has the player use 1 card to get 6 stats. More resources spent for a greater result. This philosophy of spending cards quickly is the key to most aggro decks, and explains some of their curve choices. But even aggro decks have to use cards of a higher cost. This is because a mana crystal and a card may be equal, but they're not interchangeable. Every turn a player receives multiple mana and only 1 card, so healthy spending requires higher cost cards. A deck that has 1 cost cards in its majority, like Quest Hunter, does not usually work. This is because come turn 5, the player then has 5 mana to spend and only a couple of cards. Not good. The ideal ratio ends up coming out to be approximately 3 mana to 1 card, at least in the case of aggro and midrange. So aggro decks, at least the top tier ones, concentrate on later cost cards as well. Even old school Face Hunter, one of the fastest decks in Hearthstone, has a majority 3 mana cards rather than 1 mana. This actually makes a lot of sense when looked at from a larger perspective. An aggro deck wants to spend all of its cards, but so long as they're all spent by the end of the game, it doesn't really matter if they're spent quickly. With a curve like this, an aggro deck can spend turns 1, 2, and 3 with 4 cards in hand, maybe 3 if they draw too many 1-drops, then spend turns 4 through 6 dropping their hand size to 0. Full investment, without any mana going to waste. Side note, hero powers by balance theory standards only give back half their investments. It's obviously a little more complicated than that, but generally speaking, investing mana into cards gets greater results than base hero powers. Just in case someone was leaving a comment wondering how hero powers figured into all of this. The answer, not very much. Anyways, while aggro does pace itself slightly, it still doesn't concentrate on efficient spending. If a deck wants to ensure its mana is used fully, it shouldn't be constructed as an aggro deck. Rather, it should go to mid-range. This is the fundamental difference between the deck types. Aggro wants to spend its cards quickly, while mid-range wants to spend them efficiently. Finally, there's control. Some players might think that control would have a curve that concentrates on large numbers of late-game cards. However, that's usually not true. Most control decks also concentrate on these early turns and make sure they have resources for them. After all, the mana in these early turns is still mana and should be spent efficiently. So even control curves need cards in that cost range close to 3 mana. The key here is that control decks concentrate on value, the idea of having more resources, cards, than their opponent. A control deck wouldn't be caught dead with a Wolf Rider, they'd rather spend that mana on an Arcane Intellect. This gives us our basic frameworks for each of our deck types. Aggro likes cards between 1 and 3 mana, midrange likes cards between 2 and 5 mana, and control needs cards between 2 and 5 mana, but can have a lot of flexibility outside of that. But some curves subvert this framework. Zoolock strongly emphasizes 1 mana cards, Secret Hunter peaks at 2 mana despite being midrange. Oddrogue is aggressive without doubts, but that's a pretty healthy number of 5 mana cards for an aggressive deck. What causes these differences? The answer is actually quite simple. Card draw. Let's look at 3 different aggressive decks: Face Hunter, Zoolock, and Tempo Mage. While Face Hunter sticks to our rules, Zoolock subverts them by emphasizing 1-drops, sometimes to a hilarious extent. Meanwhile, Tempo Mage seems somewhat more normal, but that's before we factor in the secrets costing nothing and Sorcerer's Apprentice further dipping cards' cost. Now, this may be the part where you might be tempted to declare curve analysis as a horrible voodoo art, but that's when we can factor in card draw as a variable. Face Hunter almost never draws extra cards. As such, its curve needs to be heavier even though the deck itself is fast. Zoolock, on the other hand, has Life Zap, meaning that it can spend more cards and have a fallback plan. As such, more 1-drops in its curve. Tempo Mage takes a different approach. It has certain cards that allow it to restock on resources. That's why it's called Tempo Mage and not Face Mage. While it's not as board focused as a mid-range deck, it does its best to maintain all of its resources, minion and hand alike. But more importantly, this card draw enables the deck to maintain a curve where some of its cards might as well be 0 mana. Generally speaking, card draw lets decks shift their curve more to the left, since there are now more cards to spend. This is a good point to bring up a couple of interesting cards: Alunith and Myra's Unstable Element. These cards provide a lot of value, to the extent that the player risks damaging themselves with fatigue. They don't actually affect the curve much at all, since they're basically a last resort. Consider cards like these more like an enabler for an aggressive deck, allowing a strategy that burns cards quickly to have a fallback plan. A similar story actually exists for Deathstalker Rexxar, but this is quickly turning into a complex rabbit hole of when is card draw good for aggro versus midrange versus control, so let's table that discussion and move on. The simple story is, the more card draw a deck has, the faster it goes to compensate. This holds true for midrange as well as aggro. Take Secret Hunter, Rastikan's current top tier midrange deck. Its curve seems heavily slanted towards 2 mana, once again subverting our rules, but that's thanks to Subject 9. That on top of Master's Call allows this deck to sometimes be so fast you would be forgiven for mistaking it for aggro. However, card draw can also make decks slower as well as faster. Take Elemental Mage, Old School Handlock, and Evenlock as examples. At heart, these are mid-range decks, but thanks to their employment of Mountain Giants, they're incentivized to build up their hands. This would limit their ability to rush down control, but that's where each deck's hero card fits in to save the day. This does leave the deck exposed to aggro, thus requiring them to include even more control pieces, but regardless. Including this new strategy makes the curve heavier compared to other mid-range decks. As for control decks, card draw doesn't affect their curve much, since gathering those resources is a core part of their strategy. Card draw usually serves as filler for the early part of their curve, giving them something to spend that mana on. So once again, control serves as somewhat of an exception to the rules due to their focus on value rather than tempo. There are a few more ways curves can be subverted. Omega cards are one example, but at that point we're splitting hairs and I can only make these videos so long. In the end, most players probably just wonder how a curve determines the health of a deck, and what distinguishes a good curve from a bad curve. So I've come up with 3 core ideas for constructing a deck with this image in mind. To help with displaying this, I'm going to build 3 wild format hunter decks, 1 aggressive, 1 midrange, and 1 control. Bear in mind these decks will not necessarily be good, they just reflect the ideas I'm presenting. Anyways, let's go. Starting off with our first rule, all curves require a peak at 3 mana or 4 mana. Any exceptions had better be super worth it. With the ideal mana card spending ratio being 3 to 1, most healthy curves will peak in this range, because no matter the deck type, all mana should be efficiently spent, especially in the early game. The only reason this should be avoided is if you're fitting in something like the Princes, a card that's incredibly strong but requires you mutilate the curve. But even of those cards, one never saw play and another is only used in Q-Block. As for Keleseth, there are a few reasons why he has been able to cut curves in half without it being such a big deal. Check out this video if you want to know more about that. For our Hunter decks, we'll be going for an aggressive Mech Hunter and a Beast midrange Hunter, and fill in some cards appropriate for each in between 1 and 5 mana. As mentioned, we're concentrating on our middle curve, even for our aggro deck. For control, we still put in the strongest pieces we can fit that give us board control, board presence, and card draw. Some of these cards may be removed later to match our synergies. Anyways, rule number 2. If you're breaking rule 1, put in some card draw. Depending on how the curve is built, the peak may be off-center. That's no worry. With the baseline curves in mind, with aggro peaking at 3 and other decks peaking at 4, more card draw will allow lighter curves to be acceptable. As mentioned before, a Zulok can have lots of 1-mana cards because of life tap, while a slower quest deck cannot. As for control, card draw is required for all but the most value-centered of value decks, and even in those it probably wouldn't be too bad. In our Hunter decks, our Mech Hunter's looking pretty good, healthy curve, no need for card draw, while our mid-range deck probably is leaning a little bit too far to the left, but that's where we fit in cards like Master's Call, to give us lots of card draw to compensate. Our control deck is actually looking pretty healthy here, so we don't need a lot of card draw, but a little bit would not go amiss. On to our final rule, do not put any cards above 5 mana in the deck unless they are necessary for the strategy. Let's check out an older card, Kel'Thuzad. Seems plenty powerful, but the card has seen little constructed play. Why is that? The answer is because of Assassinate, or more accurately, because of hard removal in general. While high mana cards get exponentially more powerful, there's a glass ceiling on their output thanks to removal effects. Any minion as large or larger than a 6/6 is actually a blessing to a rival control deck, since they can remove it and walk away with more value. Any card considered must provide value even in the worst case scenario, and should directly support the strategy in place. This is part of the reason that the range for important cards stops at 5 mana. Most minions that cost more than 5 mana are too easy to counter. Exceptions are few and far between. By all means, keep an eye out for those exceptions and include them, but remember that cards that are cheaper and therefore harder to counter will always be more important. Now, control often requires high cost cards, and to reflect that, I'll be making a Flark's Boomzooka Hunter. Here, the big beast synergize with the spell, as well as with Revenge of the Wild, plus Dire Frenzy, plus Kathrena, plus Zul'jin, but note that the curve itself still has a focus on 3 mana. Those are our 3 rules, but it's time for our final lesson. A curve isn't everything. This control deck that we built kinda sucks, and why wouldn't it? It's Control Hunter, it's inherently a meme. Alright, if he has Pyroblast, I'm gonna be mildly miffed. Hey! In the end, the curve is reflective of only a part of the deck's strategy, not the whole thing. But studying this subject allows us to understand some aspects of Hearthstone that are not immediately clear. The peaks of these curves, the nature of aggressive decks versus mid-range decks, how high-cost minions don't end up working, all of these are subjects that could warrant further study. But with a general idea in place, hopefully we can now look at the curve of a deck and understand why it's shaped the way it is, what that tells us, and how it could potentially be improved. But perhaps you'd like to know more directly how these decks operate. If you're seeking that type of knowledge, then I would point you towards this episode's sponsor, ProGuides. ProGuides provides its users with hundreds of videos detailing different strategies and techniques for Hearthstone, as well as other games. Each lesson is broken up into step-by-step chapters that ensure its ideas are conveyed smoothly, with content covering topics from playing different deck genres to succeeding in Arena to how to best handle the mulligan. ProGuides has it all. Visit proguides.com/penniless to see the different courses the site has to offer, now free to sign up and start using. If you've dreamed of reaching the heights of Arena or the constructed ladder, ProGuides is here to help you out. Once again, that's proguides.com/penniless. Check them out, thank you all, and I'll see you all next time.